The November mist held low over Arlington, like a drawn breath that refused to break, and Sentinel Sergeant Keith Okonkwo moved through it with exact, unbroken cadence, his boots clicking in perfect rhythm across the black mat as marble and flag and rows of white headstones stood in witness. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. No flourish, no drift. Duty measured in motion. By 8:10 that morning, the light had shifted from gray to a pale silver that made the tomb look less carved than consecrated, as if the stone itself had learned to carry memory. The crowd gathered in a crescent beyond the chains, and even those who arrived talking reached the rail and fell silent without being told. A father lowered his hand from mid-gesture. A teenager eased her phone down to her side. A man in a faded Vietnam cap removed it and pressed it to his chest with a care usually reserved for fragile glass. Keith stood 6 feet 3 inches in full ceremonial uniform, broad-shouldered and still as a fixed point when stillness was required, then precise as a metronome when the ritual demanded movement. His kepi sat at an exact angle. His white gloves were pristine. Brass flashed at every measured turn. Every crease on his coat looked sharp enough to cut glass, every line of fabric aligned with a discipline that had no room for vanity because it answered to something older than ego. To the visitors, he was an emblem. To those who had worn uniforms of their own, he was a promise kept in public. The wind moved through bare branches above the amphitheater and carried the faint rustle of coats, the distant call of a bird, and the soft, involuntary sounds of people trying not to intrude on sacred ground. A retired army nurse, silver hair pinned neatly under a wool hat, watched Keith with the narrowed focus of someone who understood the cost of composure. Beside her stood an elderly couple holding hands, both wearing small pins near the lapel, their posture upright despite age as if posture itself were part of tribute. 3 high school cadets in pressed uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder, suddenly uncertain in the best possible way, seeing a standard that stripped pretense from performance. Keith completed the 21st step and executed the turn with a crisp economy that seemed almost mechanical until one noticed the tiny calibrations inside it. Heel placement, shoulder angle, rifle control, breath regulation. Nothing was casual, nothing improvised. The M14 remained steady, not as ornament but as extension of office, the way a judge's gavel is not wood, but authority. His face was unreadable, carved from discipline, jaw set beneath a faint scar that traced from ear toward chin like a pale seam from another lifetime. His eyes stayed fixed on a point beyond the immediate crowd, seeing everything and giving away nothing. A small boy near the front, bundled in a navy coat, tugged once at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Does he ever get tired?" The mother did not answer immediately. She looked at the tomb, then at the sentinel, then back to her son. "He keeps watch," she said softly. "No, that's the job." The boy nodded as if that explained more than rest ever could. Near the left rail, a man in a wheelchair wore a Marine Corps blanket over his knees despite the cold. 2 middle-aged women stood behind him, one hand on each handle. Though he clearly did not need pushing, they held the chair as if it were a flagstaff in wind. The man's right hand shook faintly from age when he lifted it into salute during Keith's pass, but his arm locked straight by sheer will before the sentinel turned at the end of the mat. No one around him looked away. In that pocket of silence, reverence was not theater. It was an agreement. Keith's internal world moved at a different speed from his body. Outwardly, he delivered the ritual with unflinching consistency. Inwardly, he tracked distances, weather, crowd density, sight lines, and the pulse of the ceremony itself. The training of the old guard had etched these calculations into reflex until awareness and obligation became a single function. He registered the child's position at the rail, the veteran's chair angle on the stone, a dropped program near the center aisle that might catch underfoot, the moisture level on the mat where mist had settled in a thin sheen. None of it touched his expression. All of it informed his next step. As he moved, the cemetery rose behind him in disciplined geometry, white markers stretching over the slopes in symmetrical ranks that made language feel small. Those stones did not argue. They did not boast. They endured. The tomb sat among them not as a monument to fame, but as a vow to those whose names had been taken by war and weather and time. Here, memory was not abstract. It was operational. It had a schedule, a chain of command, and a guard who would not abandon post. A tour guide at the edge of the gathering had begun the morning with a practiced voice, but once the sentinel started his pass, she lowered her words until they became little more than breath. "The watch is continuous," she murmured to the group clustered around her. "In all weather, at all hours." She said no more. The sentence was enough. An older man beside her, wearing an Air Force insignia pin above his pocket, wiped at his eyes with 2 fingers and kept his gaze fixed forward, not hiding grief so much as allowing it without spectacle. Keith halted at the north end, executed the shoulder movement, and set for the next pass. The motion was exact, but not lifeless. There was intention in it, a measured gravity that transformed repetition into pledge. On each turn, the polished stock of the rifle caught a line of morning light, and the brief flash looked almost like signal fire, as if the ceremony itself were speaking in code across generations. You are not forgotten. You are not unguarded. You are not gone while we still stand watch. A young girl in a red scarf counted under her breath with each step, her gloved fingers tapping against the chain rail in tiny increments. Her grandfather, tall and lean with a bronze star cap pulled low, watched her counting and gave a faint nod each time she reached 7, 14, 21, then whispered, "That number means respect." She looked up at him, then back at Keith, eyes wide with the dawning recognition that rules could carry love when words ran out. Her hands went still. The mist began to thin around the upper trees, and sunlight edged the marble with a clean white glow. In that light, Keith looked less like an individual and more like a continuation, another sentinel in a lineage that predated him and would outlast him. Yet he was not anonymous inside that tradition. Beneath the polished shoes and immaculate fabric stood a man forged by years when dust replaced mist, and incoming rounds replaced birdsong, a soldier who had learned that vigilance is not loud when it is real. The tomb had taken that hard-won vigilance and given it a sacred address. At the back of the crowd, a woman with a gold star lapel pin pressed a folded letter in her coat pocket, fingertips resting over it whenever Keith passed her line of sight. She had brought no camera. She asked for nothing. She stood through the cold because bearing witness was, for her, a form of speaking to someone who could not answer. Each click of Keith's heel on the mat was received like punctuation in that private conversation, and the steadiness of his pace seemed to give shape to grief that otherwise scattered. The amphitheater did what cathedrals do when reverence is shared. It made strangers hold still together. Tourists from different states, veterans from different wars, school children with different accents, families with different losses, all settled into one common silence, while the sentinel moved through his measured circuit. No speech announced the meaning. No banner explained it. The meaning lived in the discipline itself, in the refusal to hurry memory simply because the world beyond those steps had become impatient. Keith completed another pass, 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. The cadence did not waver when a gust pushed colder air down the slope. It did not waver when someone in the far rear coughed. It did not waver when a distant aircraft sound rolled across the horizon and faded. The point of the watch was constancy, and constancy, in a nation trained to move fast and forget quickly, had become its own act of moral resistance. A man in a business coat, briefcase tucked under one arm, had arrived with a distracted expression of someone between meetings. But halfway through Keith's next turn, he set the briefcase at his feet and straightened, chin lifting, as if remembering an instruction learned long ago. Around him, others mirrored the same unconscious correction of posture. Shoulders squared, hats removed, eyes forward. In the sentinel's presence, the crowd recalibrated to a higher standard, without command, drawn upward by the gravity of ritual rather than pushed by force. Keith reached the end of the mat again, pivoted, and advanced into the next measured line. His boots clicked against the surface with the clean percussion of precision, and the sound traveled out over marble and stone like a heartbeat amplified by architecture. The flag above the tomb stirred in the November wind, stripes lifting, settling, lifting again. No one spoke. No one needed to. In that hush, under that flag, with headstones standing in ordered ranks, and a sentinel keeping faith, step by exact step, the nation's memory held its ground. The distant aircraft note that rolled across Arlington did not vanish into the clouds. It carried forward over the river, over traffic, over the steel and glass of a city already in motion, and met another morning at Reagan National, where sacred rhythm collided with civilian haste under fluorescent light and departure boards. At Gate Corridor C, the polished floor reflected shoes, wheels, and impatience in equal measure. Announcements chimed overhead. Rolling suitcases rattled. Coffee steamed in paper cups. 1,000 private agendas pressed shoulder to shoulder, and none of them planned to yield. Eleanor Hayes moved carefully through that current in a black POW/MIA jacket, faded at the seams by 4 decades of use. The patch on her right shoulder stitched so many years earlier it had softened at the edges like a handled photograph. Her silver hair was pinned in place with deliberate hands. Her left hand gripped the strap of a small carry bag. Her right hand rested against the pendant at her throat, thumb circling the engraved metal by habit, as if touch could keep a promise alive. 2 steps behind her walked Sentinel Sergeant Keith Okonkwo, broad frame controlled, posture exact, white gloves bright even under airport lights, ceremonial detail case in his left hand, and observational discipline in every silent glance. To most travelers, he looked like a uniform out of context, ceremonial precision misplaced among delayed flights and charging stations. To those who knew, he looked like what he was, a soldier assigned to memory. A man trained to map movement patterns in crowded spaces without turning his head. He tracked exits, hands, line congestion, voice escalation, and the widening pocket of room around Eleanor that came whenever veterans noticed her jacket and stepped aside with quiet courtesy. A wheelchair-bound Marine in a desert cap gave her a small nod near the moving walkway. 3 high school cadets carrying miniature flags lowered their chatter and stood straighter as Keith passed. A retired nurse near the service desk clocked his bearing in one glance and watched the lane behind him the way hospital staff watch a monitor before anyone else hears the alarm. Then Damien Vale entered the corridor like his schedule outranked everyone else's pulse. He wore a charcoal suit cut to advertise money, platinum cufflinks catching hard white light, a watch face bright as a coin. 2 private security contractors moved with him, one ahead clearing space with a flat palm, one behind scanning faces for cameras and inconvenience. Vale's jaw was set in practiced irritation, phone at his ear, voice clipped as he discussed a televised contract signing at the Pentagon in tones that assumed doors would open and clocks would bend. He did not lower his call when he saw Eleanor. He did not slow when the flow narrowed. He angled his shoulder and drove through the gap. The impact caught Eleanor off balance. Her bag swung wide. Her heel slipped on the tile seam. Keith moved 1/2 step before her weight recovered, but the necklace chain at her throat snapped with a metallic tick sharp enough to cut through terminal noise. The pendant dropped, struck polished floor, spun once, twice, then slid under the edge of a stanchion base where shoes almost found it. Vale looked over his shoulder, irritation hardening into contempt, when he registered Keith's uniform. "Move, parade boy. You're blocking my lane." The corridor went still in stages. Then, all at once, the wheelchair veteran stopped rolling and locked his brakes. One of the cadets reached instinctively for the smallest flag in his pack and held it against his chest. A mother near the coffee kiosk gripped her son's shoulder before he could step forward. Airline staff halted mid-stride with scanner wands in hand. A baggage cart beeped twice and then stood idle because the driver forgot to move. Even the overhead announcement seemed to thin, as if the terminal itself recognized a line had been crossed. Vale, still speaking into his phone, snapped his fingers at his security team and jerked his chin toward Eleanor. "Handle this. She's causing a scene." He was wrong in 3 directions at once. Eleanor had not caused anything except silence. Keith was not scenery, and the scene itself was no longer his. What Vale could not see in Keith's unreadable expression was the rapid, disciplined computation behind it. Distance to Eleanor, 2 feet. Distance to nearest security wrist, 4.5 feet. Floor friction under formal soles. Moderate, slight moisture near the beverage spill sign. Legal threshold for intervention. Imminent interference with protected civilian guest. Crowd volatility risk. Rising but containable. What he also could not know was that the name etched on the pendant, now resting inches from strangers' shoes, had already struck a buried coordinate in Keith's memory. One connected to a dead friend, a desert blast wall, and a vow spoken in another hemisphere. Eleanor steadied, breath shallow, hand at her throat, where the chain had broken, eyes briefly unfocused, with the shock of being shoved and then sharpened by old discipline that had survived telegrams, years, and unreturned footsteps. She did not cry out. She whispered one word almost to herself. "Thomas," and looked down at the floor where the pendant had gone. Keith's right hand tightened by a fraction on the detail case handle. His face remained carved from command restraint. In his peripheral vision, he saw one security contractor shift his weight toward Eleanor, hand extending in that false help gesture used to direct people out of the way while pretending to assist. In that same sliver of time, he heard a child's voice from the edge of the frozen lane ask, softly and confused, "Why is the soldier man so still?" Because stillness was the last wall before force. Because discipline chose sequence when anger wanted impact. Because he had spent years learning that the first move in a crowded civilian corridor had to be lawful, proportional, and decisive enough to prevent the second move from becoming chaos. The pendant stopped spinning. Keith moved. Not toward Vale yet. Down. He set the detail case upright with controlled precision, dropped to one knee on the airport tile in full ceremonial uniform, as if the terminal floor had become sacred ground by contact, and reached under the stanchion base with white-gloved fingers. The chain came out first, broken links catching light. Then the pendant, small, oval, scratched by years of touch, heavy for its size. He turned it once in his palm. Captain Thomas Hayes, USAF, POW/MIA. The corridor did not breathe. The retired nurse at the service desk pressed her hand to her mouth. The Marine in the wheelchair whispered, "Lord." Not loud enough to travel far, just enough to anchor the moment in a witness. One cadet mouthed the engraved letters as if reciting from a memorial wall. Eleanor's shoulders trembled once when she saw the pendant in Keith's hand and then held firm. Vale's expression flickered, not with understanding, but with annoyance that his timetable had been interrupted by emotion he considered administrative. That was the exact second tension reached its highest wire. One widow, one name, one uniform, one man rich enough to mistake impatience for authority, and an entire terminal waiting to see whether honor still had operational force outside marble and ceremony. Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and if you believe that values like honor, courage, and sacrifice still matter, join us in keeping their legacy alive. Now return to that corridor, to the pendant resting in Keith Okonkwo's palm, to the bright tile reflecting a scene that had outgrown airport etiquette and entered moral jurisdiction. Anticipation did not come from raised voices. It came from the exact opposite, from the tightening quiet that forms when a crowd senses that one man is about to define a boundary in language no security badge can overrule. Keith remained on one knee for one measured beat longer, not from hesitation, but from respect. He lifted the pendant with both hands as if it were a color being presented, then stood to full height, 6'3" of controlled force, and the corridor seemed to narrow around him. 2 days earlier, his detail briefing had listed logistical items in clipped military format: ceremonial transport, route security, honored family escort, contingency coordination with federal airport police, onward movement to Arlington by secured vehicle. Buried inside those lines had been a name that struck him like a muted bell at first pass, and like live current on the second. Eleanor Hayes, widow of Captain Thomas Hayes, status updated after declassification review, first tomb visit in 40 years. Keith had said nothing in the briefing room. Tomb guards did not perform emotion during tasking. But he had memorized the name before the slide changed, because names mattered, and because another Hayes had once carried that same surname through smoke and dust with a grin that refused to break. By the second morning of the escort assignment, Keith had checked his ceremonial uniform 3 times before departure, not from vanity, from principle. Brass aligned, gig line straight, kepi angle exact, gloves unmarked, shoes polished to mirror depth. A uniform that immaculate was not costume, it was argument. It told the public that remembrance deserved rigor, not approximation. It told families like Eleanor's that someone had prepared with the seriousness their dead had earned. In the van from Arlington, Eleanor had ridden in the rear seat with both hands folded over her bag and answered the driver's small courtesies with a quiet that carried long years inside it. Only once had she volunteered more than a sentence. They were passing the Potomac when she asked Keith, without looking up, "Do they still read names at dawn on Mondays?" He had answered in formal cadence, "Yes, ma'am," weather permitting, and in all duty conditions. She had nodded, then touched the pendant at her throat, thumb tracing letters she did not need to read. No further explanation was required. He understood the grammar of grief that comes without display. What the crowd at Gate Corridor C could not have known, what Vale could never have guessed, was that Keith's connection to that pendant was not abstract military solidarity. Staff Sergeant Ryan Hayes had carried a photograph of his grandmother in his chest pocket through 2 Afghanistan rotations and 1 Syria deployment, and on the back of that photo he had taped a handwritten line, "Keep him on watch until he comes home." Ryan had been the steady shot on bad nights, the one who checked younger Marines' hydration before his own, the one who could make a plywood chow hall laugh in under 10 seconds after indirect fire by dropping his tray and announcing, with mock ceremony, "Guess I'm qualifying for the Chow Line Olympics." He had died shielding civilians from a VBIED, while Keith dragged 2 wounded men behind concrete blast barriers under mortar smoke. The Bronze Star with valor on Keith's record was tied to that day. The scar on his jawline was tied to that day. The vow that brought him to the old guard was tied to that day. 3 minutes had passed in Corridor C since Vale's shove, though for witnesses it felt like an extended single second stretched across fluorescent light and polished stone. Airport Federal Police had been alerted by 2 separate staff calls and 1 veteran at the kiosk hitting an emergency contact button reserved for medical incidents. Lieutenant General Marcus Whitaker's convoy, inbound for the Pentagon event, that Vale kept invoking on his phone, had already entered airport perimeter traffic and diverted toward the terminal entrance when dispatch relayed possible assault, honored military family involved. Consequence was in motion, even before Vale realized the ground beneath his certainty had shifted. Eleanor's breathing had steadied by then. She straightened her jacket, adjusted the broken chain in her hands, and lifted her chin with the composure of a woman who had lived through headlines, silence, and decades of unanswered paperwork without surrendering her husband's name to bureaucratic dust. Her eyes met Keith's once. In that brief exchange lived recognition, gratitude, and an older command: hold the line. At the edge of the crowd, the young boy who had asked about the still soldier reached up to his mother again, this time whispering, "Is he guarding her?" The mother swallowed and answered, "Yes, that's what it looks like." The wheelchair veteran beside them nodded once without taking his gaze off Vale. Keith did not speak yet. He measured. He held the pendant level in his gloved hand, inscription outward. He shifted his stance 1 precise fraction so that Eleanor stood behind his left shoulder, protected by geometry and presence. Vale's security contractors checked one another's faces, uncertainty replacing corporate confidence, as they finally read the room and understood they were no longer managing congestion. They were standing in front of witnesses, cameras, veterans, a decorated soldier, and a name that had turned a public space into a tribunal of memory. The terminal waited on the next sentence. Keith held the pendant steady at chest height, and the terminal's fluorescent glare flashed across the scratched metal like cold fire. Around him, Reagan National kept moving only at its edges, where distant escalators carried strangers who had not yet understood why Gate Corridor C had gone silent. While inside that corridor, every witness had settled into stillness with the instinctive discipline of people standing at a graveside. A gate agent with a red scarf and a nameplate that read Morales lowered her scanner wand and took 1 step back from her counter, eyes fixed on Eleanor's face. A retiree in an Air Force cap tightened his grip on the handle of his roller bag until his knuckles blanched. A pair of college students in sweatshirts, earbuds hanging unused around their necks, stopped recording with their phones and simply watched. The crowd had become a single organism, alert, quiet, waiting. The airport smelled of jet fuel filtered through climate control, burnt coffee, floor polish, damp wool coats, and the metallic trace of winter rain dragged in on shoes. Screens above the corridor flipped from boarding notices to delay advisories, green text to yellow text, but no one in that knot of people looked up. Their attention stayed locked on one soldier in ceremonial dress, standing between a widow and a man who had mistaken money for command authority. Keith's kepi sat exact above a brow that did not crease. His coat lay flat across his shoulders with geometric precision, every seam disciplined, every brass button bright enough to reflect terminal light as hard points. The white gloves were spotless, except for one faint gray smear from the stanchion base where he had retrieved the chain. His shoes held a mirror finish despite travel. The faint scar along his jawline ran pale against dark skin, a narrow signature from another country and another morning. 30 feet behind the crowd line, near a charging station, an elderly woman with a gold star pin folded her cane and stood on her own feet to see more clearly. At the coffee kiosk, a young father lifted his daughter into his arms so she would not be jostled. She wore pink earmuffs and clutched a toy plane, and she stared at Keith with solemn concentration, usually reserved for church candles. The wheelchair-bound Marine had shifted his chair sideways to block accidental foot traffic from entering the lane, an old tactical habit repurposed for civilian protection. Beside him, the retired nurse who had recognized Keith's bearing early moved closer to Eleanor's right flank without fanfare, ready if the widow's knees weakened again. No one announced these choices. They happened because honor, when visible, draws allies without formal command. In Keith's peripheral vision, Vale remained a rigid silhouette framed by two uncertain contractors and a rolling billboard for privilege, charcoal wool that sat perfectly on expensive shoulders, platinum links glinting at his cuffs, polished shoes untouched by weather, phone still in hand as if a call could reverse reality. Yet even Vale's posture had altered by a degree. His chin was still raised, but his weight had drifted backward, and one polished toe had edged a fraction away from Keith's line. The terminal's hum returned in thin layers, a child crying from a distant gate, the tremor of a PA tone, the clack of luggage wheels far off, but in Corridor C sound no longer belonged to routine commerce. It belonged to witness. Keith adjusted his stance again, subtle and exact. Left shoulder slightly aft to shield Eleanor, right foot angled for stability on tile, pendant still visible, chin level. He looked carved from institutional memory, but beneath that stillness, his assessment grid kept cycling. Contractor hand position unchanged. Vale's phone grip tightening. Federal response not yet visible in corridor entrance. Crowd density stable with clear egress lane at 9 o'clock. Civilian distress low but vulnerable elder requiring immediate de-escalation by command voice when he chose to speak. His breathing stayed even. His pulse did not rush. Years of training had taught him that composure under eyes was not theater. It was protective architecture. For one suspended instant, the polished floor, the gate numbers, the ads for vacation packages, the caffeine lines, and the constant American hurry stood in direct contrast to another landscape that lived in Keith's muscles. Arlington's pale stone under November mist, the measured percussion of heels on black mat, white headstones rising in ordered ranks beyond the amphitheater. The same morning held both worlds at once. In one, people rushed and bargained and checked watches. In the other, time was given back to the dead in exact increments of discipline. Keith had moved between those worlds often enough to understand the tension as a national fact. Sacred duty did not remain sealed on a hill. It had to survive baggage claim, traffic lanes, bright corridors, and men who called devotion a costume. He had reported for the escort at first light with the same care he brought to a tomb walk. In the prep room at Arlington, under steady fluorescent bulbs and the quiet supervision of a sergeant major who inspected details with merciless respect, Keith had brushed one invisible fleck from his sleeve, reset his gig line by millimeters, and checked his gloves twice. The M14 for tomb duty remained secured at post. For this transport detail, he carried no ceremonial rifle, only orders and responsibility. Yet the bearing did not change. Sentinel posture was not equipment-dependent, it was dependent. When he stepped outside that morning, frost traced the grass near the drive, and the tomb's marble held a dawn sheen, like a light trapped in stone. By the time the motor vehicle crossed the bridge toward the airport, Arlington was behind him in distance, never in duty. Eleanor shifted her weight and lifted her hand toward the pendant, but she did not take it yet. Her fingers stopped halfway, as if she needed to see it in the open air one more second to confirm that memory had not been dropped and crushed under rushing feet. Her jacket's black fabric had faded to charcoal at elbows and seams, and the POW/MIA patch was worn soft from decades of touch. Keith saw, as he always saw, the small physical clues of long endurance. The careful repairs at the pocket edge, the old wedding band worn thin, the upright posture of someone who had trained her body not to fold under waiting. She met his eyes, and her voice was low but steady. "Thank you, Sergeant." He gave the smallest nod. "Yes, ma'am." The corridor remained attentive. A teenage cadet near the wall whispered to his friend, "That's not just a necklace." His friend answered, "No." At the service desk, Morales quietly hit a second internal alert for supervisory presence and then placed both hands flat on the counter to keep them from shaking. The retired nurse murmured to Eleanor, "I'm right here." And Eleanor answered with one short inhale and a faint, grateful tilt of the head. Keith did not lower the pendant. He gathered the broken chain into his left palm and held the engraved plate steady in his right glove, angled outward so Vail, the contractors, and every witness could read what entitlement had struck to the floor. Captain Thomas Hayes, USAF, POW/MIA. Eleanor's hands remained cupped near her sternum, ready but still, her gaze fixed on the metal as if anchoring herself to it before the next word in the corridor was spoken. Around them, shoulders did not ease. They set. That name had carried farther than anyone in that corridor knew, and as Keith held the inscription in plain view, memory opened with the force of a door unlatched in a storm. He had first met Staff Sergeant Ryan Hayes in Kandahar during his first Afghanistan tour, late summer heat pressing down like a physical weight, rotor wash kicking dust across every exposed surface, until the whole outpost tasted of grit and fuel. Keith had been a newly promoted team lead then, focused, reserved, already precise. Ryan arrived with a duffel slung over one shoulder, grin unbothered by heat or rank, and introduced himself by offering half a crushed granola bar to the room before he found his rack. "New guy tax," he had said. "You take this, I take point on dish duty." Nobody took the granola bar. Everybody laughed. That was Ryan's gift. He cut tension without cutting standards. By the second week, they had run their first joint patrol outside the wire, and Keith learned Ryan's pattern quickly. He checked radio batteries twice, gave water to younger Marines before he drank, and kept a folded photo in his left chest pocket that he touched with his thumb before mounted movement. One night, after a long return under sporadic fire, they sat on ammo crates behind a HESCO barrier eating lukewarm chow while indirect rounds echoed miles away. Ryan pulled out the photo and handed it over. An older woman in a front yard garden, smiling into sun, hair tied back with a blue scarf. On the back, in cramped pen, "Keep him on watch until he comes home." Ryan tapped the words. "My grandmother," he said. "Thomas Hayes was her husband, POW 72. She wears his name on a necklace every day. Says somebody has to stand watch." He shrugged, a little embarrassed by his own sincerity. "I guess now it's us." Keith had 2 Afghanistan tours and 1 Syria rotation by the time he left sustained combat operations. He saw mountain roads where dust swallowed convoy lights, village clinics where children clutched donated notebooks like treasure, and city blocks in Syria reduced to sharp-edged concrete and hanging wires where every doorway could hide a trigger. He also saw the best of men under strain, medics who worked through fatigue with hands steady as machines, squad leaders who carried extra batteries for everyone and complaint for no one, interpreters who stood exposed beside them because trust, once given, had to be honored. In that crucible, Ryan remained exactly himself, disciplined, direct, relentlessly human. During the second Afghanistan deployment, after a mortar scare rattled the chow tent and sent trays skidding, Ryan had bent, scooped his own food from the floor with theatrical despair, and announced to 3 exhausted squads, "Guess I'm qualifying for the Chow Line Olympics." The laugh that followed rolled through that tent like medicine. Keith remembered it now with a pressure in his chest that never fully eased, because humor from men like Ryan was not frivolous. It was resistance against fear. The day they lost him came near the end of Keith's 3rd combat year, on an urban edge route where concrete barriers made narrow channels and traffic moved in uneven bursts. A vehicle packed with explosives surged toward a crowded civilian choke point after a checkpoint breach. Ryan saw the vector first, shouted warning, and moved toward the line of non-combatants to redirect them behind cover. The blast hit before full evacuation, a violent wall of pressure and debris that erased sound for several seconds and turned daylight into particulate haze. Keith, concussed and bleeding from the jaw where shrapnel tore through skin, pulled 2 wounded Marines behind barrier sections, while Ryan held a position he knew he could not hold long. Civilians survived that lane because he stood there. The citation later used clean language, conspicuous gallantry, decisive action under fire. Lives saved. Keith's Bronze Star with Valor sat in a presentation case he rarely opened. The scar remained visible every morning in the mirror. The absence remained visible nowhere and everywhere. By mid-October of the year after Syria, Keith had submitted his packet for the old guard. Some men around him asked why a decorated combat NCO would choose ceremonial duty. He answered in one sentence, "This is where the nation keeps its promises." What he did not explain to most was the deeper equation. At the tomb, vigilance was continuous. At the tomb, no missing name was treated as administrative residue. At the tomb, discipline transformed grief into public honor every hour of every day. For Keith, that was not retirement from hard service. It was its continuation in another form. Training for Sentinel qualification stripped him down and rebuilt him with harsher precision than many outsiders could imagine. Uniform preparation took hours. Historical knowledge demands were exhaustive. March cadence had to remain exact under weather, fatigue, and scrutiny. Rifle manual had no tolerance for drift. Most candidates washed out. Keith did not. He advanced through each evaluation with the same internal rule that had kept him alive in firefights. No shortcuts, no excuses, no compromise with standards that protect others. When he received the Tomb Guard identification badge, he did not celebrate publicly. He called Ryan's grandmother instead. Eleanor Hayes answered on the 3rd ring, voice measured, polite with strangers. Keith introduced himself by rank and unit, then said Ryan's name. Silence held for 3 beats. Then she said, "I wondered when one of you might call." They spoke for 11 minutes. She told him she still wore Thomas's pendant, still set an extra place at Thanksgiving, still believed that waiting was a form of duty when done with honor. Before hanging up, she gave him one instruction, wrapped as blessing. "Stand straight for all of them, Sergeant. Not just ours." Now, in Gate Corridor C, that same woman stood 3 feet behind his shoulder, with 40 years of fidelity in her posture, while Thomas Hayes's pendant remained in Keith's raised glove between her and the man who had mocked what it meant. The airport's bright, impatient world pressed in from every side, but Keith's center held where it always held, in oath, in memory, in the unbroken line between the unknown dead and the living who refused to let them vanish. He drew one controlled breath, lifted his chin a fraction, and prepared to speak into the silence that had already chosen its side. He spoke without raising his volume, and the corridor heard him as if the ceiling had dropped lower. "Mr. Vale, step back from Mrs. Hayes. Now." Damian Vale's mouth tilted into the same camera-ready smirk that had sold investors on disruption and sold commentators on the myth that speed was a substitute for character. He lowered his phone from his ear at last, not to comply, but to display irritation in full. Up close, every marker of him advertised acquisition, platinum cufflinks, cut with his company crest, suit fabric that held a perfect line even in transit, carry-on stamped with a custom monogram, 2 security contractors with coiled earpieces and corporate posture. He was 42, founder of Vale Dynamic Systems, a defense technology empire built on autonomous targeting software, surveillance contracts, and keynote speeches delivered in language polished enough to make procurement sound like destiny. Morning shows called him visionary. Business magazines called him inevitable. His people called ahead to terminal, so he never stood in a line longer than 30 seconds. He looked at Keith the way men like him often looked at institutions they had never served, as scenery to root around. "You don't give me commands," Vale said. His voice carried just far enough to be public. "You're ceremonial. Stay in your lane." A tight whisper moved through the witnesses, then stopped. The cadet nearest the wall swallowed hard. The retired nurse shifted her stance, closer to Eleanor's right elbow. Morales at the counter kept her scanner lowered and fixed her eyes on Keith as though anchoring herself to his composure. Keith did not move. The pendant remained visible in Eleanor's clasped hands, chain gathered beneath her fingers, inscription catching the light like evidence and oath at once. "This corridor is my lane while she is under my escort." Vale gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "Escort? She tripped. I'm late for a Pentagon signature, and this whole little pageant is blocking movement." He flicked 2 fingers toward Eleanor without looking at her. "Get her to a chair." One contractor took half a step, then stopped when Keith's left shoulder angled 3 degrees and turned the space in front of Eleanor into a boundary no trained adult could mistake. By 9:02 a.m., 3 separate phones in the terminal had already logged the same event from different vantage points. Elderly military widow shoved, military escort intervening, possible assault by high-profile contractor principal. None of those reports had reached public screens yet, but consequence was building in channels Vale could not command with a donation. The Air Force retiree near the luggage column spoke under his breath to nobody in particular. That woman buried 40 years standing up. His voice cracked on the last word. Beside him, a young father tightened his hold on his daughter and whispered, "Watch the sergeant's hands. He isn't shaking." Vale heard neither line, or treated both as static. He straightened his cuff, lifted his chin, and addressed Keith with bored contempt sharpened for an audience. "Move, toy soldier!" The phrase hit the corridor like a slap, not because it was loud, but because everyone present now understood exactly what Vale believed, that uniforms were decorative, that grief was procedural, that money could issue commands to duty itself. His fatal assumption stood naked in fluorescent light. He thought rank by wealth outranked rank by sacrifice. Keith's face remained unreadable, carved from restraint. You will address her as Mrs. Hayes, he said. You will step back. Vale's security lead raised both palms in the neutral de-escalation gesture, favored by private firms trying to keep footage manageable. Sir, he said to Vale quietly, let's relocate. Vale ignored him. He pointed first at Eleanor, then at Keith. She's delaying federal movement. He's escalating. I want both removed from this corridor. Morales finally found her voice. Sir, federal movement is not your call. Vale turned on her, incredulous. Do you know who I am? From the coffee kiosk, the wheelchair-bound Marine answered before Morales could. Name's not the same as honor, son. Several heads nodded. A high school cadet, maybe 16, lowered his flag to his side and stood straighter, jaw set in a way that made him suddenly look older. Eleanor said nothing. She stood with both hands folded over the broken chain and kept her eyes on the pendant in her own hands as though it were the only stable object in the terminal. Keith gave a brief glance to the pendant in Eleanor's hands, care contrasting every jagged edge of the scene around them. Ma'am, hold this for me. She closed her fingers over it. I will. Then he stepped exactly once, placing his frame between her and Vale, shoulders squared, feet planted, voice level enough to cut clean. Mr. Vale, you are now interfering with a protected military family movement and attempting to displace an honored guest by force. Step back and remain silent until federal officers arrive. Vale blinked once, surprised less by the words than by the fact that anyone had spoken to him in statutory terms instead of customer service tones. He started to answer, but the contractor behind him touched his sleeve with urgent pressure. Vale yanked free. Across the corridor, two bystanders who had been filming lowered their phones completely when they heard the words, protected military family. The atmosphere shifted from spectacle to testimony. People were no longer waiting for drama. They were waiting for procedure. Seconds stretched and thickened. The digital departures board clicked from 9:03 to 9:04. Somewhere beyond security glass, a jet reversed from its gate with a long mechanical whine. In Corridor C, nobody moved more than an inch. To the crowd, Keith looked motionless, almost austere in ceremonial posture. Inside, his assessment grid ran at combat tempo. Vale's right hand still free, no obvious weapon, but impulsive reach probability moderate. Contractor 1 compliant posture, Contractor 2 scanning exits, both likely to disengage if federal authority appeared. Eleanor stable but fatigued, possible orthostatic sway if prolonged standing. Civilian density high behind Vale, low behind Keith due to improvised witness cordon. Acoustic conditions clear enough for command voice. Legal threshold for physical intervention. Only on forward advance or contact attempt. He tracked all of it, while breathing evenly through his nose, shoulders loose beneath the immaculate coat, jaw unclenched despite the old scar tugging with cold and memory. He had stood in far worse noise with less certainty, and had learned that the body could carry adrenaline without surrendering precision. Training at the tomb had refined that lesson into ritual. No wasted motion, no theatrical anger, no abandonment of standard even when provoked by contempt. A little boy near the service desk asked his mother, barely above a whisper, "Is this like at Arlington?" She answered, "Yes, stand still." He did. Vale tried one more tactic, the old move of appealing upward to invisible influence. He raised his phone again, thumb stabbing at contacts. "Get me the deputy undersecretary," he said to whoever answered. "I've got a uniformed obstruction at National." Keith heard the line and did not flinch. The retired nurse heard it too and gave a short, disbelieving exhale. The Marine in the wheelchair shook his head once, slowly, as if he had seen this collision before, in different decades with different faces. At 9:05 a.m., a plainclothes federal airport officer appeared at the far mouth of the corridor, scanning, hand near his credential wallet, then paused when he saw the dense witness ring and the ceremonial uniform at center. A second officer followed 10 seconds later. They did not push through yet. They assessed, as professionals do, and waited for a clean verbal handoff. Keith registered their arrival in peripheral vision and stayed fixed on Vale. His instincts were on high alert, every muscle coiled beneath stillness, but his voice when he spoke again remained formal and unhurried. "Mr. Vale, this is your final instruction. Step back 2 paces. Keep your hands visible." Vale's jaw tightened. He did not step back. He held his ground in polished shoes and public arrogance, phone still at his ear, lips forming the beginning of another demand. The corridor held breath as one. Eleanor lifted her chin behind Keith's shoulder and spoke for the first time directly to Vale, her tone quiet enough that people leaned in to hear it. "My husband waited in a cell so men like you could rush through airports. You will not rush through his name." That line landed harder than any shout. Vale's mouth closed. One contractor looked down at the floor. The cadet near the wall pressed his lips together and stared straight ahead to keep his composure. Keith did not turn toward Eleanor, but the smallest shift in his posture acknowledged her words like a salute received. He kept his stance locked, weight balanced over both feet, palms open at thigh level, ready for any forward movement without looking ready at all. From the corridor entrance came the clipped command tone of federal authority, cutting through ambient noise. "Federal police, nobody move." Heads turned, then snapped back to center. 2 uniformed airport federal officers advanced with measured urgency, badges out, while behind them a transportation security supervisory agent moved to the crowd edge to maintain corridor space. No sirens, no chaos, pure procedure. Vale straightened, as if preparing to reclaim narrative. "Officer, finally, remove this man." Neither officer touched Keith. Neither officer looked at his uniform and guessed. The lead officer looked first to Eleanor, then to the broken chain in her hands, then to Keith's posture and the witness ring, and understood the architecture of the scene in one practice scan. "Sergeant," the officer said. "Nah, status." Keith answered in parade ground clarity. "Sentinel Sergeant Keith Okonkwo, 3rd Infantry Regiment, Old Guard Detail escorting Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, honored POW family guest. Principal here initiated physical contact with protected guest, issued removal order through private security, and continued interference after verbal commands to disengage." The officer nodded once. "Copy." Vale opened his mouth again, but the second officer raised a hand without looking at him. "Sir, hold your statements." The terminal went quieter still. Even the announcements seemed farther away. At the far end of Corridor C, beyond the federal officers and the witness line, another presence entered with unmistakable command gravity. Service cap, dark overcoat, 2 aides in trail. Lieutenant General Marcus Whitaker moved through the parted lane with brisk, controlled pace, face set, eyes already on Eleanor and Keith. He was still 30 yards out, not yet speaking, but his arrival passed through the crowd like current through wire. Keith saw him, marked distance, and held exactly where he was. Vale saw him too, and for the first time that morning his certainty showed a crack. Vale saw Whitaker's service cap, and the corridor geometry collapsed around him. The smirk did not survive the next breath. His phone lowered to his side, screen still lit, and for the first time his eyes moved from Keith's chest insignia to the pendant in Eleanor's hands, then back to the federal badges now closing from both flanks. He opened his mouth to reclaim control, but no words came out with force. Keith turned his head a fraction toward Eleanor, and in that precise motion, the terminal felt the handoff from warning to judgment. "Ma'am," he said, formal and low, "may I?" Eleanor placed the pendant and broken chain back into his white glove without hesitation. Her fingers trembled once as the metal left her palm, then steadied. Keith drew the chain across his gloved thumb, found the split link by touch, and folded it through the clasp ring with the same deliberate care he used to set a rifle sling for inspection. It was not jeweler's work. It was field work, secure enough to hold, respectful enough to present. Then he stepped. One step only. Heel down, shoulder square, pendant raised to chest level in his right hand, the repaired loop hanging clean so the engraving faced outward under the terminal lights. The motion was slow enough that every witness could follow each inch of it, and controlled enough that it looked less like confrontation than ceremony brought into hostile ground. His voice carried like a command read at parade rest. "This name stood watch before you were born. You will step back now." No one spoke for a full beat. The words did what shouting could not. They stripped Vale's status down to size and restored scale to the room. A widow, a missing captain, a sentinel, a public line no wealth could purchase passage through. Gasps moved through the crowd in a visible ripple. The young father tightened his arm around his daughter. The cadets went rigid. Morales at the counter bowed her head for a second, as if at chapel. The wheelchair Marine's hand rose into a trembling salute and stayed there. Vale took one involuntary half-step back, then another. His contractor nearest the wall exhaled in relief he could not hide. The second contractor lowered both hands and shifted behind his principal. No longer screening forward movement, only containing fallout. Vale's jaw worked, searching for a retort that would not sound small. He found none. Federal Officer Ramirez reached conversational distance and stopped, posture neutral but absolute. "Sir," he said to Vale, "hands visible at your sides. Do not approach the protected party." Officer Delaney moved to Eleanor's open side, body angled as a shield without crowding her, and gave a quiet nod that asked permission before offering support. Eleanor accepted with a faint incline of her head and remained standing on her own. Lieutenant General Marcus Whitaker crossed the last yards with clipped, unhurried power, overcoat open over service uniform, 4 stars bright even in airport lighting. His aides halted 2 paces behind him. He did not look at Vale first. He looked at Eleanor Hayes, then at the pendant held upright by Keith, and his expression hardened into formal respect. "Mrs. Hayes," Whitaker said, voice resonant and clear. "Lieutenant General Marcus Whitaker, on behalf of the United States Army, I apologize for this disgraceful treatment in a federal terminal." Eleanor held his gaze. "General," she said, "thank you for coming." Only then did Whitaker turn to Vale. The crowd drew tighter without moving. "Mr. Vale," Whitaker said, "you will remain silent while federal officers take statements." Vale tried anyway. "General, this is a misunderstanding. I have a Pentagon signature in 40 minutes and—" Whitaker cut him off with a glance sharp enough to stop a convoy. "You had one?" At 9:06 a.m., 1 minute after Whitaker entered the corridor, the terminal clocks seemed to matter again, because authority had shifted from personality to chain of command. Whitaker extended his hand without looking back. One aide placed a secure phone in it. Whitaker keyed a direct line from memory. "Operations, this is Whitaker. Effective immediately, suspend all Vale Dynamics, principal access credentials for Pentagon, and annex facilities pending federal review. Mark cause, active interference with protected military family movement, and alleged assault in federal space." confirm receipt. He listened for 2 seconds. Read back. Another 2 seconds. Correct. Execute now. He ended the call and handed the phone back. Vale's face drained of color in increments. You can't do that unilaterally, he said, voice thinner now. My office has standing clearance. Whitaker answered without raising volume. Your office has what the department grants. As of this moment, it has a hold. He turned to Ramirez. Officer, you have military cooperation and witness saturation. Process accordingly. Ramirez nodded. Yes, sir. We've got 3 internal alerts, 2 staff reports, and multiple civilian statements queued. Camera coverage confirms contact event. That resolved the corridor's loose threads in public view. The calls had landed. The reports existed. The witness accounts were no longer rumor. They were procedure. Delaney addressed Eleanor gently. Ma'am, we can seat you while we complete documentation. Eleanor straightened her jacket. I can stand. Keith lowered the pendant by exactly 3 inches and turned toward her. Ma'am, permission to restore. At her nod, he placed the chain carefully back around her neck and secured the temporary clasp behind the collar seam so the engraving settled centered over her sternum. His gloves never snagged the fabric. The gesture was small, but the crowd watched it like the final movement of a flag-folding detail. Vale made one last attempt to reassert weight. General, you're choosing optics over strategic partnership. Whitaker's response came like steel on stone. I am choosing honor over arrogance and law over convenience. A low murmur moved through the witnesses, not rowdy, not triumphant, just the sound of collective recognition that consequence had arrived in plain daylight. The cadet nearest the wall wiped his eyes with the heel of his palm and stood harder at attention. The retired nurse placed a steady hand on Eleanor's forearm, and Eleanor covered that hand for a second in thanks. Ramirez stepped to Vale with a tablet and stylus. Sir, you are not under arrest at this moment. You are being detained for identification and statement in relation to alleged assault and interference. Refusal to comply will escalate status. Do you understand? Vale stared at the screen, then at the ring of witnesses, then at Whitaker, who did not blink. I understand, he said. State your full legal name for the record. Damian Cole Vale. Employer. Vale Dynamic Systems. Ramirez entered the data and continued in measured cadence. Delaney collected contractor IDs and separated both men for independent statements. Neither resisted. The contractors were professionals. They had read the room long ago. Whitaker turned to Keith. Sergeant Okonkwo. Sir, you acted with discipline and legal precision under provocation. Well done. Keith held parade stillness. Thank you, sir. Whitaker's eyes moved briefly to the scar on Keith's jaw, then to the Tomb Guard badge. Recognition passed between soldiers without spectacle. You kept faith with the mission, the general said quietly, then louder for the corridor. And with the family. The words landed with more force than applause could have. No one clapped. In that space, people removed hats. Morales stepped out from behind her counter and addressed Eleanor with careful respect. Mrs. Hayes, we can open a private passage to your vehicle when you're ready. Her voice shook on the last word, then stabilized. You won't be crowded again. Thank you, Eleanor said. Whitaker signaled one aide. Coordinate immediate onward movement to Arlington. Revised route, no media exposure, no delays. The aide moved to execute, already speaking into his comms unit. The second aide handed Ramirez a printed event credential packet, and Ramirez attached it to the incident file with a note visible on screen. Protected guest status confirmed. Keith scanned the corridor once more. threat assessment decelerating now that the line had held. He noted the cleared egress lane, officers in position, Eleanor stable, antagonist contained, witness crowd calm. Duty was no longer confrontation. Duty had returned to escort. Vale stood inside that new order with his shoulders slightly rounded, the performance stripped away. He was not handcuffed, not shoved, not publicly cursed. He was simply overruled by institutions he had presumed to command. For a man built on deference, that was humiliation enough. Whitaker gave the final directive. Mr. Vale will not proceed to any defense venue today. Federal review first. Copy that across all checkpoints. Copied, Ramirez said. Eleanor touched the pendant at her throat and looked up at Keith. Sergeant, she said, voice quiet but steady. Let's go finish what we came for. Keith inclined his head. Yes, ma'am. He turned, opened a clear path with his presence rather than his hands, and began guiding her toward the secured exit. The witnesses parted in respectful silence. Veterans first, then families, then travelers with laptops and boarding passes suddenly held low. The wheelchair Marine held his salute until Eleanor passed him, then lowered it with care. The little girl in pink earmuffs pressed her toy plane to her chest and whispered, "Bye, soldier," as Keith moved by. He did not break bearing, but his left hand shifted one fraction closer to Eleanor's pace, matching her stride exactly. Behind them, federal procedure continued around Vale in clipped, unemotional cadence. Statements were logged. IDs were verified. Access holds propagated across systems. The profane machinery of hurry kept humming in distant gates, but in Corridor C the hierarchy had been reset in full view, not by force, by standard. At the threshold to the private passage, Whitaker stopped beside Keith for one final sentence, low enough for only 3 people to hear. Arlington is ready for her. Eleanor closed her eyes once, then opened them. After 40 years, she said. That's all I needed. Keith straightened to full ceremonial height, the white gloves bright against dark wool and terminal glass, and answered with the calm of a man whose duty had never changed, only moved locations for an hour. We'll take you home to him, ma'am. He did. The private passage smelled of waxed tile and cold air from a loading bay door that opened and shut in measured intervals, and Keith matched Eleanor Hayes step for step, while Federal Officer Delaney walked 3 paces ahead, clearing corners with quiet professionalism. The ceremonial transport case never left Keith's left hand. At the vehicle door, he paused long enough to check the temporary clasp one more time, white glove steady at Eleanor's collar seam, and when he saw the pendant resting centered over her sternum, he gave a single nod and helped her into the rear seat without hurry. Lieutenant General Whitaker leaned to the open door, voice lowered for dignity, not secrecy. Mrs. Hayes, the rail at the tomb will be clear on arrival. No press, only witnesses who came to honor. Eleanor answered. That is all I ever asked. By early afternoon, the November light had sharpened, and Arlington rose ahead of them in white lines and winter grass, the same sacred geometry that had held the morning before the airport corridor ever learned her name. In the moving vehicle, Whitaker's aide read outcomes in clipped cadence from a secure tablet, so Keith and Eleanor both could hear what procedure had done after principal held. Federal reports from Officers Ramirez and Delaney had been filed and stamped. Airport camera footage had been preserved and attached. The 3 internal alerts were reconciled into a single incident package. Statements from Morales, the retired nurse, the wheelchair Marine, and the Air Force retiree had been logged in full. Vale's Pentagon access suspension had propagated across checkpoints and annex systems, and a formal interference and assault referral had been transmitted to federal prosecutors for review. No thread was left hanging in bureaucracy. No call had vanished into silence. At the Sally Port, near the amphitheater, Sergeant Major Colin Reeves met them with a clipboard tucked under one arm and eyes that missed nothing. He took the ceremonial transport case from Keith, checked its tamper seal, and initialed the handoff with ritual precision before returning it to controlled storage. Case received intact. 1317, he said. Chain repair kit logged back in. Keith produced the small field clasp kit from his coat pocket. Reeves accepted it, bagged it, and marked it as used in support of protected family escort, then looked to Eleanor with formal gentleness. Ma'am, if you permit, our quartermaster jeweler can restore the original link after the ceremony at no cost. Eleanor touched the pendant once. After I speak his name, she said. Reeves answered, Yes, ma'am, after. The witnesses were already gathering, not as spectacle, as congregation. Veterans in worn unit caps stood beside school cadets with their phones put away. Families lifted children to see and then set them down again when the hush settled. The retired Army nurse from the airport stood near the rail in a dark coat, hands folded, and when Eleanor recognized her, they exchanged a brief look that needed no language. Morales had come too, hair tied back, airport badge still clipped to her belt, because she had come straight from shift. She stood at the rear with hat in both hands, eyes red but steady. The Air Force retiree from Corridor C stood bareheaded despite the cold. The wheelchair Marine had arrived with his daughters, who parked him at the same angle he had chosen, in the terminal, as if line of sight itself were an act of respect. Keith moved into preparation with the same discipline that had carried him through fire and fluorescent insult alike. In the ready room, he checked gloves, reset one brass edge, and took his post weapon from secured arms under supervision, every motion signed, witnessed, and returned to ritual. His uniform remained immaculate. The faint gray smear from the stanchion was gone, replaced by clean white cotton and a standard restored. Externally, he was carved stone again. Internally, he carried the whole day in layered detail. Tile glare, whispered questions, a widow's steady chin, a general's clipped order, and a name that had bridged 40 years without breaking. At 1340, Eleanor stepped to the rail. The wind was colder here than at the airport, cleaner too, carrying damp earth, old leaves, and the distant metallic note of a flag halyard under tension. She held one white rose by the stem, thorns removed, bloom open against black wool. Whitaker stood a respectful distance behind her, with service cap under his arm. Keith took position on the mat. The world narrowed to cadence. His boots clicked in perfect rhythm. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. Repeat. The sound traveled over marble and returned in measured echoes from stone seats and winter trees. Every shoulder in the crowd drew back into alignment, as if pulled by one invisible thread. The little boy from the morning crowd at Arlington, now seated in a compact wheelchair beside his father in a navy peacoat, watched Keith with fierce concentration, lips counting each step without sound. At 7, his fingers tapped the wheel rim. At 14, he stilled. At 21, he breathed out and lifted his chin exactly as his father had taught him. Eleanor waited through one full pass before she moved. Then, during the pause between turns, she placed the white rose at the rail with both hands and whispered, "Thomas Hayes." The name barely rose above the wind, yet every person near her heard it, and the silence that followed was not emptiness. It was reception. Whitaker lowered his head. Morales covered her mouth with her fingertips. The retired nurse closed her eyes and let one tear fall without wiping it. Keith completed the turn and advanced again. To the crowd, he was unshaken ceremony. Inside, the words from Kandahar and Corridor C aligned into one unbroken vow. Keep him on watch until he comes home. For men like Thomas Hayes, home had arrived differently than any family deserved, through declassified lines and delayed certainty, but memory had kept the door open. That was the work, not pageantry, continuity. After the next pass, Sergeant Major Reeves approached Eleanor at Whitaker's signal and offered a small padded envelope. "Ma'am, Quartermaster completed the permanent repair while you were at the rail. Original link restored." He opened it so she could see. No theatrical flourish, just competent care. Eleanor unclasped the temporary fix, handed the pendant to Reeves, and waited while he secured the restored chain with gloved precision. When the clasp clicked shut, she touched the engraving and gave him a nod of gratitude that seemed to lift 10 years off her shoulders. Behind them, Federal Officer Ramirez arrived in plain clothes, hat in hand, having come directly from paperwork close out. He stopped at the edge of the crowd and quietly briefed Whitaker. "General, incident package accepted. Prosecutorial intake confirmed receipt at 12:48. Mr. Vale's counsel acknowledged service of notice. Contractors corroborated the contact sequence and removal command. Airport operations added a formal commendation note for Sergeant Okonkwo's restraint." Whitaker answered, "Thank you, officer." No one cheered. At the tomb, justice was acknowledged in silence. The child in the wheelchair leaned toward his father and whispered, this time audible to those closest, "Can I do it now?" His father swallowed and said, "Yes, do it right." The boy raised his small hand to his brow in a careful salute. Elbow high, wrist straight, eyes fixed on Keith. It was not perfect. It was sincere. Keith reached the turn point, halted, and in the narrow allowance of protocol gave the smallest visible nod in the boy's direction before executing his pivot. The boy's face lit with solemn pride, and the father looked down quickly, blinking hard. No one interrupted the cadence, not the general, not the officers, not the families, not the witnesses who had seen sacred duty tested under fluorescent impatience and restored on marble. The retired nurse, who had first recognized military bearing in the airport, stood beside Morales and finally spoke the sentence she had swallowed there. "I knew he would hold the line." Morales nodded. He did. The afternoon light tilted west. Wind moved the flag in steady lifts. Headstones stood in endless ordered ranks beyond the amphitheater, white and unwavering against the November slope. Eleanor remained at the rail for one final minute, fingers resting over the repaired pendant at her throat, then stepped back beside Whitaker and whispered, "He's not waiting alone anymore." Whitaker answered, "No, ma'am, he isn't." Keith continued, 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat. Boots on marble, rifle steady, white gloves pristine. The tomb held its silence like a vow renewed, and around it stood a nation reminded that earned honor does not yield to wealth, noise, or time.